Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming to the talk at the end of what I'm sure has been a very long day and a very long conference so far. Still a couple of days to go. This is a shorter session. It's half an hour. I hope to make as many points as I can in that half an hour. And I hope also to give us an opportunity to do talking with your neighbour. Not too many talking to your neighbours, but there must be at least one talk to your neighbour activity in any session at IATEFL. My name's Debra Marsh. I'm Head of Teacher Professional Development at Macmillan Education. In fact, I started my career, or I got my first teaching job from Birmingham. I wasn't teaching in Birmingham. I was at Aston University, when they used to be 20-storey tower blocks and a fire engine, for those of you who knew Aston University very well. I was a graduate, French and German graduate, and like many of my fellow students who did languages, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with my career. I ended up as an ELT teacher. If I ask for a show of hands, I would imagine 50-60% of that room fall into the same category as myself. Without going into too many details of how many years ago that first job was leaving Aston University, this might give you a clue that these were some of my teaching tools when I started teaching. Quick show of hands. Remember, it's dark, so don't give anything away. How many remember the cassettes? Oh, brilliant. Some of you are as nearly as old as I am. How many of you had to go into class with a pencil and turn that pesky tape round? Yeah, okay. All the same age generation. I then graduated to language labs, hated the things. I was the teacher who went into the language lab with the tape recorder. Not because I didn't know how to use the language lab, but I just couldn't see the point. By the time I'd finished my teaching career, the classroom career, I was then at DVDs and CD-ROMs. The pace of change, the technological pace of change, is accelerating, even when we look from 1996. 10 years later, 2016, I don't know why I'm looking up there, isn't it? 2016, the pace of change in technology has been quite phenomenal. The pace of change in methods of approaches, not so fast. If you can read the slide, some of those have been around for a long time, and we're not moving forward. But the pace of change of delivery, in terms of how we deliver the teaching and learning, is moving at a tremendous rate. And our classrooms. If I went back into a classroom now as a teacher, as the young teacher all those years ago, how much change would there be? I hasten to add that's not my classroom. How much change has there been in our classrooms? What is the difference between the classrooms of yesteryear and the classrooms of today? The focus of my talk today is the flipped classroom, because I believe the most significant change that technology is bringing in terms of the flipped classroom and the impact is going to be in the classroom and on the role of the teacher. The pace of change, the rate of change, and the evolution, the next step where we need to go, has very little to do with the technology, but everything to do with that classroom that hasn't changed and evolved, and us, the teacher. And what I want to do in this very brief presentation is consider the need to reframe the role of the teacher and the impact this could have, and this will have, on future teacher development. Because in all the advances in the technological change, it's high time, look at me, the teacher, it's high time to consider the place we have in this fastly accelerating change of technology. Now, having said that this is not anything about technology, my first question to you, the most important EdTech trends of 2016. In January of this year, EdSurge brought out a survey predicting, not a survey, but a prediction, if you like, of the future EdTech trends for 2016. Very quickly, with the person next to you, what do you think one of those trends were? Tell that person next to you. What do you think a future trend for 2016 is? a quick one. Did you get any of these? Did any of these trends come up in your discussion? And in particular, did this come up? Or did this come up? It's interesting that the prediction for an ed tech change is around learning models and professional development. Because yes, it's time, you're going to see a lot of my little face, it's time for the teacher to say, yes, look at me. Where do I fit into all of this? Up until quite recently, teachers have felt quite threatened with the technology. They've felt threatened by the fast and accelerating pace of change. But they haven't been considered within that framework of where do they fit into this. And I think it's really interesting that a prediction for a trend is professional development and learning models. Looking at the flipped classroom, and in particular, the flipped language classroom. Many of you will be familiar with this graphic that has been used on numerous occasions on many different websites to explain what the flipped classroom is. We have during the class, where the students are practicing and applying key concepts. The idea is that the classroom becomes the focal point for the actual practice. We have the before class, where the students are preparing, and essentially that has started off with meaning that the instructional content is taken out of the classroom and put in, and the student does that at home. A lot of that has been associated with video, but it doesn't necessarily have to be video. And there's the after class, which we're quite familiar with. We used to call it homework, and getting the students to practice and extend their learning. In the context of the language classroom, what does this actually mean? And in particular, for the purposes of this session, what does it mean in the class? And of course then, what does it mean for me, the teacher? What is my role in all of this? Right then, with your newly found friend that you were talking to 2 seconds ago, what do you think? What is the application of the flipped model specific to the language classroom? What is specific, what's going to happen in that class? But then what are the implications then for me, the teacher? Talk to the friend next to you. These are what you call speedy pair work, speedy group activities, racing on as much time possible. What I'd like you to do is hold the thoughts and those discussions that you've had with the person next to you. Because what I'm going to do now is I'm going to be throwing out a number of ideas that we're working on at the moment at Macmillan Education, and in particular with my team, the Teacher Professional Development team. Ideas for looking forward for the future of teacher professional development. I'm not saying we've got it right yet, but I think we're working in the right direction. And I'd like you to think it through, and if we have time at the end to ask some questions, so that we can actually test some of our hypotheses. Every time you see my little teacher, it's me. That's a little time for reflection. I will pause for breath, you'll be glad to know, for a few seconds, so you've got time to collect your thoughts, and then I'll move on to the next idea. Starting with the class and learning objectives. If you think back to the last 2-3 lessons that you taught, for some of us it may be going back a little bit further than others, think back to that lesson, think about the time you put into it for planning, and think about what the actual objective was. And then think about which part of that lesson did I not actually get to? Which part of that lesson did I not find the time to do for all sorts of reasons? Several years ago, I conducted a survey with over 300 teachers asking that very question. What do you think the vast majority of teachers came back to me saying they did not have the time to do, they did not get to? Yeah, speaking, production, most of us. How many times have we spent hours and hours and hours planning our lessons, putting our lessons together with the learning objective, by the end of this lesson, my students will be able to communicate in whatever way. And how many times by the end of this lesson I ran out of time and they all ran out the door when the bell rang? Because the shape of many of our lessons tends to end up like that, through no fault of our own, but through the dynamics within the classroom. The majority of our lesson time is used introducing the concepts, making sure it's practiced, making sure our mixed ability class is with us, so that when we do that final production and communication activity, the whole class is with us. What we really want is a classroom shape like that, where the majority of the time is used with allowing the students to use that language, test the concepts, and some of that time, and not as much, is when we can then introduce and provide some practice. Now, you all know where I'm going with this, because this is the flipped model. We've been striving for the flipped model, all our teaching lives probably, wanting that bigger chunk of our lesson to be that communication activity. Now they call it flipped classroom. But potentially, this model is something that can support language learning, potentially could change the way we teach in the classrooms, the way we support our students, and potentially, I'm using the word potentially because it's still very early days, and potentially have a better learning experience for our students. However, there are a number of implications here. There are opportunities. Several years ago, I worked with large groups of teachers who implemented this model, years before the flipped idea came into common currency. What they wanted to do was quite simple. They wanted to maximize the time in the classroom and to ensure that the students could use the language and practice the language in a communicative setting. And at the same time, they wanted to find a way of having that presentation and practice before the class. Many opportunities, and what they were looking at was repurpose that class time, changing the dynamics of what's happening in the classroom. What they found were the students were actively engaged. You'll see that when I see the challenges, you'll see that there's always the flip side, excuse the pun, of either one, that there's active learning and student engagement. Increased participation in class because it was communication, there was pair work, it was group work, and people working together. And there was a change in dynamic and priorities. Now for the teacher, what's in it for me? For most of those teachers, they found it a very, very motivating experience. It improved their teaching experience, and they enjoyed it. Not all teachers, and there's a clear reason why. However, in any of this, there are the challenges. The in and out class of work needs to be very, very carefully integrated. Because if it's not carefully prepared and it's not integrated, the students don't see the sense and the flow between what they're doing before class, in class, and then after class. This provides a tremendous challenge to teachers. There's also managing student expectations. They expect us to teach. They expect to sit there. They don't expect to be potentially active. It's also managing parental expectations, and in some instances, managing the institutional expectations of what teaching is all about. And of course, the new skills required of our teacher. Because in this context, we're asking the teacher to actually do very different, produce a structure for the classroom very different to the structure that she's used to, but also certain skills that she doesn't often use within the classroom, these are having to be developed. So in a sense, the role of the teacher in that situation is being reframed, is being changed. Now, if I put up a traditional framework, if you think about this one, you'll all recognise this. We all sigh. The 3 Ps, those of us who did the CELTA many years ago, we hung on to this framework for dear life. Well, I did anyway. This saved my life on many an occasion when I was a young teacher. And I'm sure most of you would admit it, although it's not very fashionable to admit that we like the 3 Ps framework. We knew what we had to do at the presentation, we knew what we had to do at the practice, and we knew what we had to do at the production. We also knew that what we had to do at the end was aim for communication. I'm not sure I ever achieved the perfect triangle. I doubt I achieved the perfect triangle, particularly with the larger production at the end. I also knew that I had to supply homework for my students. For me as the teacher, particularly the young teacher, this provided the framework. Whether we use this traditional framework or whether we use it now much more disaggregated in different portions, there is still an element that in the classroom, as teachers, we know that we need to introduce the language, we present the language, and then we provide some practice so that the students can use it. But if we're talking about the flip model, and then we're saying that the flip model is a good idea because it may improve learning outcomes, it could improve the learning experience, we're looking at a very different framework. Because the framework that the vast majority of teachers have been used to in their training, or they're used to in their course books, hands up, I work for a publisher, but in many course books, this is the structure we do. There's the presentation of the language, input of the language and the practice, and there's a diddly bit at the bottom, now work in pairs for communication. What about this for looking at a framework for the flipped language classroom? You start looking at the in-class. So the in-class is all about context, personalised. And this is where the student-to-student interaction is maximised. Flipped classroom model, where we're making best use of classroom time. You're then looking at the before class. Discover, explore, prepare. So the students are discovering, exploring the language. Again, flipped classroom model, input at the beginning. And then you're looking at after class. So we're giving a sort of framework, which if we wanted to put it in some diagrammatic form, we could add bubbles like this. Before class, in class, and after class. And what I've added here is exposure to language. Because the students today have much more exposure to the native language, to the L1 now, than when I was teaching. My students were lucky to actually get the World Service on some crackly radio, whereas now they've got access to it all. So I've actually added exposure to language as part of this framework, something the teacher is looking to bring into her teaching. In all of this, you'd hope there'd be some language learning. And in all of this, we've got the teacher. My question to you, if we look at a model, if we're developing a model, a different model for the flipped language classroom, what are the implications to the teacher? Thinking back to your previous discussion 10 minutes ago with your partner, now thinking through the ideas I've been throwing out about frameworks and principles and guidelines, what is the implication here for teacher development going forward? 2 minutes, because we're running out of time. Go. Oh, thank you. I'll stop you there. There's something really lovely working with ELT teachers, because the minute you say work in pairs, you just go, you're off. Not always the case. So, as I said, we haven't got the answers at the moment, but what we're looking at is developing a framework that, as a starting point for developing out what this flipped classroom is, as a starting point for working with the technology. But the technology doesn't necessarily have to be in the classroom. It's out of the classroom. The starting point, I suppose in my own mind, when I remembered myself as a beginning teacher, I hung on to that framework, but that framework also allowed me to be very creative. I didn't ever feel constricted by the framework, but at least it gave me a starting point. It gave me a starting point to be allowed to explore my own ideas of where I'm going. So although I've got some sort of floating model here, I'm not saying it's the right model, but it may be something that the starting out teacher, or a teacher who wants to start looking into the flipped classroom and is not particularly confident, is able to hold on to. It would be quite easy to give a quick checklist. Okay, getting flipping started. This is a summary of the key points that I've just made. It's a starting point. Give it to the teacher, they take it away, and they can start thinking through their planning. But I think I would suggest that we need to take it a step further. We need to go beyond the checklist. We need to go beyond the quick sound bites, as I call them, before class, after class, review, consolidate, and we need to explore it a lot further. Recently, there's been a lot of discussion about teacher development, and the quotes that are now going to come up on the screen are not necessarily ELT related. But I think what we need to look at is that pedagogical underpinning of what we actually mean by before class, in class, and out of class. There's time now to explore much more deeply what we mean by this language learning, what we want to do in the classroom, and how we can achieve it. Not what the technology can do, and how we can follow behind it. This is forming the basis of the work we're doing at Macmillan. It's very much a starting point, and we have a long-term plan and a long-term strategy of how we're going to evolve. I hope you found it interesting, and if anybody would like to be involved, please do get in touch, because we would really like to hear your thoughts and your understanding on it. I've managed to allow us 4 minutes for questions. So if you have any questions or disagreements, or anything you don't understand, please ask now. Otherwise, my email's on the do email after the session. Thank you very much. Any questions? Not sure if the clapping means no, there's no questions. We're all going home, but anybody would like to ask any questions? I can hear. I can hear the voice. There you go. Yeah.
One of your slides talked about managing student expectations.
Yes.
Which I would imagine is quite a big part of their traditional perceived role of the teacher. Do you have any tips as to how you can manage those expectations, both for the student and institutions who see a teacher's role as something different?
Yeah, I would strongly suggest that you do an incremental approach. It's not all or nothing. You don't need to flip every single one of your classrooms. You don't need to have all the classes, but to do it incrementally on classes that are easier to flip than others. It doesn't have to be all the time. In fact, as a teacher, you may decide that one class, you just really can't do this. I need to do the whole input and the practice. But it does need to be incremental. Take the students with you. The parents will follow. Hopefully, again, it's 30 days and there's not enough research that's been done to the actual learning outcomes. But our understanding of second language acquisition would suggest that if we give more time for the students to actually use the language in the classroom, it would suggest that actually the learning outcomes and the learning ability and the language ability of students would be stronger. This is all very much hypothesis. But I would take it incrementally, take it step by step, implement bits, but have a plan. Say, okay, by the end of this semester, by the end of the year, I'm going to flip a percentage of my classes. Rather than saying, right, I'm going to flip all my classes, day one, here I go. I don't think your students would take that very kindly. Any other questions? Sure, hi. This is for the light.
My teaching context for most of my years has been in Africa, so that's what's behind what I'm about to say. I certainly see the value of technology in the flipped classroom, but the flipped concept's not solely dependent on technology, right?
No.
mean, you can create
Yes.
a concept
Yep. Yep.
if you're willing to do all the work in advance of the things you would need to give the students to do it.
Or you're willing, I shouldn't say this to the public, take a pair of scissors to your course book and cut it out literally and put it into different parts. But yes, it doesn't depend on the technology. The technology facilitates it because the technology allows us, gives the students feedback. Again, in theory, is more motivating, but there is a sense also that the students don't want the technology all the time. There's an interesting quote, it was up there, that we don't need technology all the time. And so yes, there is that balance. If you're going to flip the classroom, it doesn't mean you have to spend hours developing podcasts, developing webinars. It's more about the principles that I'm interested in, the actual principle of the flipped classroom and how to apply it, and then think about the technology afterwards. Yeah.
So you said
Hey,
people can contribute. How can they contribute?
If you would like to email me, and I'll keep you up to date where we're going, and then when we get some research projects, I'll be in touch with you. I promise. Yes. I think that's a sign telling me that I need to stop, or I can't really read it from here. If you would like, is it 5 minutes? I got 55 on here. If you would like to download any of the session slides, or the references that I made, and all the quotes that I made, you can do that off the Padlet. There's the cue card that if you would like to have that, the session slides right there. I need to update the session slides. I had a bit of a disaster with my computer yesterday, so they don't quite match on there as they did today. Okay, I'll be around for the next 10 minutes if anybody would like to talk, but I know it's been a long one, and thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.